Welcome to the Computer Repair Podcast, episode number 288, Rural Managed Services. I'm your host, Jeff Halash. This is our live show where we discuss the ins and outs of running your computer repair business. Computer Repair Podcast is brought to you by Malwarebytes Tech Bench, the comprehensive partnership program for repair shops looking to boost margins and grow their business. This includes a portable tool set to help you diagnose, remediate, and secure PCs. Malwarebytes Tech Bench, built for technicians by technicians. Sign up today at malwarebytes.com/techbench. Let me introduce the co-hosts. We have returning again, Adam Carpenter from IT Professionals of Iowa. How you doing, Adam?
I'm great. Happy to be here.
Awesome to have you. And a newcomer who has been wanting to come on the show and share some of his knowledge is Cody Richards from IT North Solutions. How you doing, Cody?
I'm doing fantastic.
Awesome to have you. All right, let's go ahead and we're going to share a tip or story that we could learn from. And Adam, I'm going to throw it to you.
All right, just a quick tip. Don't let your customers push you into doing something quicker than you're comfortable with. What I mean with that is, let's say you take on a new customer or you're supporting hardware you're not familiar with and they want you to make changes, whether it be networking equipment or whatever, or replace something. Make sure, there's plenty of resources out there for everybody. There's groups like this, there's the Facebook group, there's TechNibble, there's all these forums. There's good places to get information. So if you're not absolutely certain on what changes you're making, just do your research ahead of time. There's no harm in telling your customer, look, we can do this. Give me a few days, give me a week to look in, make sure I have this right, so that way we don't cause any undue downtime. Just make sure you do your homework, especially on a product you're not familiar with. That's really the tip.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great tip and something to definitely remember. All right, Cody, you're up.
Right. So actually, even to just expand on Adam's point, if you have managed service clients where a specialized software is needed, you really should be subscribing to their form of support. I know it's mentioned many times on this show. So to turn around and say, hey, let me do my homework on this. However, we are subscribed to the QuickBooks professionals. Why don't we give them a call and see what they think? So, yeah, absolutely. Just getting into the swing of things. My tip, when you're reinstalling Windows, whether if you're going down the route of a bare metal restore, which we all know can be very exciting, there's a tip that a technician that I met swears by, and he does not format the hard drive when he reinstalls Windows. He simply reinstalls, selects the partition that Windows is stored on, and of course everything moves to the windows.old folder. We know that happens during updates. We know that happens during any sort of weird things with the operating system. What I did not know about that is that if something goes catastrophically wrong and you absolutely need to recover that, you can go to your system image, but you can apparently just move those files back to, you can move the program files, you can move the system folder all back to their original position on the drive. And it just magically becomes the operating system that you had before. Something I did not know. I work mainly based off of images, and if I'm going to do a bare metal restore, it's going to be bare metal. But it's something that I've tried once. It works. I'd be interested if anyone else knows about this Windows.old reinstall tip. I'd love to hear more about it. But yeah, I found it handy. It certainly worked in a pinch. And I didn't necessarily, of course, I backed up the data, but I didn't have to plug into an external interface to transfer everything back. It was already on the drive in this Windows.old folder. So it was snapped. I obviously scanned everything, made sure there's no malware. Seemed to work great. So I want to throw that out there and see if there's any response on that.
That's awesome.
That's interesting. So if you were to restore those files, the program files and those things back, my only concern would be the registry, because I'm thinking if you're doing a clean install, what registry entries are going to be missing if you try to copy those files back?
So this was my concern. My number one concern was, hey, if I'm going to do a full system restore, chances are it's because it's malware or something like that, something that I wouldn't want back on the system anyway. But the story that this actually came from was from an entire reinstall where the technician had lost the product code to a specific product, you turn to the customer. The customer has no idea what you're talking about. Product code, what? So he managed to move everything back. I would assume that wherever the product code was stored, it may have been stored in the registry and came back over. Like I said, I've only done it once, so I didn't get a chance to look into it too much, but everything seemed to be working. So I would be very hesitant to, put it into production until I've fully tried and tested it. But for that purpose, it worked great. And just remember to always back up your data anytime you're going to do anything like that anyhow.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think a lot of times with the Windows.old file folder that's being created now, you are able to go back to a previous version. They started with when Windows 7 was going to Windows 10. So it kind of makes sense with what you're saying. And again, it's another tool in the toolbox, especially if you need it for one of these situations. Now, to be honest with you, in today's day and age with Windows 10, it is so fast and the updates are done on the fly when you're loading this thing that I don't know. I've never done a whole lot with images in the back. I've always liked doing fresh installs. The problem is back in the day, my fresh installs would take me 13 hours. And now that was installing, getting all my programs back to where I liked them, setting everything up so I had access to it. And it was a 13-hour process, which I seem to do every 3 to 6 months. Yes, that's a little nuts. Now it's like pulling teeth out or sticking a fork in my eye to actually do a reinstall on my system unless there's something wrong. So a lot of times I'll keep my system for about 3 years and I just run it. Usually replace it after that anyways. So I'm doing a fresh install, but it's not my system anymore at that point. But yeah, no, that's good to know, to have some sort of recovery process in case you do get into trouble. And that's always the biggest thing is with programs. Programs, you can't just move a program from one system to another because, like Adam was saying, you've got all these registry entries and things that you have. But I'm wondering if Windows 10 is just doing something in the background that's able to basically make it come together with the registry entries that were there before. Because I'm not sure what's in the .old folder.
Well, so in the Windows.old folder, you essentially have 4 different folders. You have your system folder, you have your program files x86, and your users folder. Sorry, the Windows folder. Windows, users, both program files folder. Which, if you think about it, is essentially your entire operating system. I mean, most people have drivers or log files in the root of their C drive, but those 4 folders are your operating system. So by simply dragging those folders back, like even your registry entries, if you have hidden files, they're there. Like your hives are there. If you show the hidden folders and kind of move everything back, oftentimes when you would be doing this kind of restore, I would presume that you're doing it from perhaps like a PXE or just a simple file manager environment. You obviously can't do this booted into the operating system. So I don't think it would be too much trouble to move all those hives over. But I think Windows 10, I love Windows 10. I think in some cases where it can't find those, it'll either try to recreate them, or maybe, I don't know. I haven't encountered a program that'll do it, but I assume it would either just not work. But I would be willing to bet that a lot of the programs out there would just work.
Awesome. Now, you just used a 3-letter acronym on my show, and obviously you haven't listened long enough to know that I hate acronyms. But what does PXE stand for?
So we are.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot because I don't even know, to be honest with you.
I got to look it up. It's something environment. Perhaps Adam can chime quicker than I can Google it.
It's the pre-execution boot environment, something like that. But it's basically where you can boot to a network image.
Right. Yeah. So it's what a lot of people will call a Pixie boot, even though it's PXE, and that's the only reason I bring it up. So there's no confusion there. Anyway, that's all right. You don't have to look it up. So, all right. My story, or tip, I should say, for the audience is always have long cables. And I've run into this situation a couple of times, especially when you're starting to do things for yourself or your customers. You have monitors that you're spreading over a longer distance than normal. You might have your computer on one side of a desk, and then you've got monitors spread across a desk. And a lot of times we would think that 6-foot cables would just reach, but they don't. And I'm not just talking about your HDMI cables, your DVI cables, your DisplayPort cables, your electrical cables. Yes, you can get those in 10-foot plus. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll go on Amazon and I'll order a couple of these cables so that I have them, especially in my network with multiple monitors set up. I've got to get it all the way across the desk. And it doesn't seem that long, but when you do it, unless you want it like stretched right in front of your face, you got to have a little slack in there and you don't want to pull tight on that stuff. So I will order HDMI cables that are 10-foot, DisplayPort, DVI, and the electrical cables that'll plug into a monitor, computer, etc. So just make sure you have those cables on hand because you never know. I always carry 6-foot cables with me, not even thinking about it. But there's been times where I've ran into an issue where I had to have something longer, and you kind of need to have those on hand. And they're so inexpensive. It pays for it in the time and effort instead of going back out to a customer just to have those on hand and keep them in your toolbox. All right. Let's see. All right. So that was my tip. Let's go ahead and go into our main topic. How do we use, or how do we even do managed services in rural areas? What I mean by that is areas that are basically, there's not a whole lot of people around. Maybe things are spread out. Maybe your internet service is slow. Maybe you don't have things like cable internet, which in my opinion is still the fastest out there. And a lot of people will say fiber, but yeah, fiber's eh, it's come and go. Yes, there's faster speeds, but in the grand sense of actual usability, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Even with the fastest internet I have here, yeah, it helps me in my download speeds. But when I'm surfing the internet or doing anything else, I don't really need that much. Same thing with, upload helps a little bit, but it all depends on what you're doing. So a lot of that stuff that we use is in the background. But anyways, this was brought to us by Cody. And Cody came up with this topic because he lives in a rural area, and this is where he does his computer repair in managed services. So, Cody, I'm going to kick it off to you, and I want to see where you wanted to go with this topic and some of the things that you have run into or you've seen in your own business as you're servicing your customers.
Right, for sure. So I will start off by saying that I live in a small town that is just big enough to actually have cable connection to the house. So there's fiber run on the poles and then last mile coax into the house. So I myself have a 100 megabit connection with a 10 megabit upload. A number of my customers are generally sitting anywhere from 10 megabits down and sub 1 megabit upload speeds. So it presents a challenge, particularly for a number of customers that want to do anything worthwhile online, or they want to do something more than just check Facebook or browse email. A lot of these are businesses that started off small, and with the growth of the internet, these businesses want to have their presence online. They want to turn to online solutions, so cloud servers and everything like that, but they don't even have the bandwidth to support it in their own office. So I deal with both sides of things. I'm obviously an MSP, so I deal with small business and residential. My full-time job, I actually work for a WISP, a wireless internet service provider. So I know the ins and outs of the wireless network in this area. It's about 100 square kilometers. DSL isn't even available. I know DSL in rural areas is a big thing in the States. Here in Canada and Ontario and Northumberland County, a lot of these rural areas don't have sort of any sort of wireline connection at all, other than their voice connection or dial-up. So it does present a challenge. There are a number of solutions out there. Motorola, Ubiquiti is a big one. Cambium. These are all solutions that we work with. I myself work with both with my company and with my my full-time job, my WISP.
Now the wireless internet service provider. So this is basically, and I know there's some places in the States that have this too, where it's basically wireless coming from a tower that people are getting their internet connection from versus a cable run to their house, correct?
That's correct. In most instances, it's, as you described, a fixed wireless situation, a point to multipoint situation where there's an access point on the tower and people are using common frequencies to connect. So either 900, 365. In the States, you guys use 3.5. 2.4 gigahertz is even used. That gets very interesting in areas where, you know, people might live closer to the tower. So I can certainly dive into that. And then the remainder of the customers, maybe that don't have line of sight to a tower, they're using satellite service. They're with the one big satellite service company in Canada, who I will not mention names, but I've heard rave reviews about their satellite service.
So even in the States here, you have things in rural areas that like DSL that you can get some sort of decent connection coming into the home. The ones that can't and actually have to do satellite, I wouldn't even bother. I would rather stick two forks in my eye and just call it a day. I would use, maybe my internet service through my phone or something like that. You would probably get better bandwidth that way than you would using a satellite service. It is, I don't care where you're at, it is horrible at best. So I definitely would stay away from that.
They normally have your favorite small caps too.
Yeah.
Bandwidth caps per month.
Really? You had to bring up caps on here? Really?
Well, yeah.
Yes.
Relevant.
Yes. We all love our caps. No, but so I do have quite a few customers that manage on satellite service. I myself, a lot of the time what I see with satellite service is the speeds are there. It's the latency. So downloading something and bringing it into, you know, your machine or bringing it into your network oftentimes isn't a problem. It's the round trip that takes quite a while, and it ends up being the upload. So for example, if you're at home and your teen daughter is uploading a Snapchat, your network is wedged because you can't send out any more requests on your 256K uplink on your satellite connection.
Even at that speed, I'm thinking bandwidth shaping or QoS isn't going to be very effective because you really just don't have much bandwidth to play with there.
You just said 256K. Just, I'll tell you what, if you live near an area that can get cable, just, man, I'll tell you, that's not much better. That's like what, 4 times better or 5 times better than dial up?
Barely. And there are, this satellite provider still provides dial-up uplink. So there are cases where some people can just barely see the download signal, can't send enough for the uplink, and their uplink will be routed over dial-up connections. So everything is done through a proxy server because, of course, with 2 connections, you can't monitor the request. You can't actually respond to anything. It's on a different connection. So you end up connecting to their proxy server, and that's essentially how you get your internet. And it works. It's once you put the latency in there, you're up to 4,000 milliseconds in some cases, and you can't do anything worthwhile on it. I don't know how they live with it, but I do what I can to make it great for them.
Now, Cody, you say that it works. Now I'm gonna be a little bit different with you here, because there are also the customers, and I've had them over the years, that basically will go down into their office, they will push the button on their computer, they will walk back upstairs, they will make a cup of coffee, like a whole pot, pour themselves a cup of coffee, put their cream and sugar in it, walk back down to the office, and Windows might just be coming online at that point. A lot of times, though, they still walk into it and you have a spinning circle. So from their standpoint, though, the reality is they don't know any better. They're like, oh, yeah, it's slow. That's all they know. It's slow. But slower than what? If that's all you have, then it really doesn't matter. So what are some of the things that you do to help your customers be able to get data back and forth?
So one of the things that I do to help out customers, regardless of whether they're on a satellite connection, whether they're on a fixed wireless connection, or this even works for customers on a DSL connection. And there's a few customers in town that have DSL where I've actually seen this work out quite well. But when you get down to choosing your router, you need to choose a router that actually routes properly, not your $30 D-Link off the shelf when you walk into Best Buy. But I generally go with Edge Router X's in my clients' homes, and by doing that, and there's a couple other routers out there that can do this. You can do this with DDWrt, but you need to have a router that would support the FQ Codal. The FQ Codal algorithm when it comes to QoS. So this is natively supported by the Edge Router X with Ubiquiti, and actually most of their Edge Router line supports it. But if you have a router at home, and it might be an older one, it might be fairly new, but you can put DDWrt on it, that certainly can help things. I personally don't like using that in a business setting or even a managed residential setting. I don't like the idea of having to put custom firmware on a router. I'd rather buy a product out of the box that supports it, that I can configure myself, that I can manage, that I know works. So reducing that so to speak, buffer bloat, when let's say you're running a speed test, you'll see a lot of buffer bloat on the connection. And for those of you who don't know what buffer bloat is, the layman term I can say is your network thinks that it can send out or receive more traffic than it actually can. So at some point on your network, one of your devices starts queuing packets, they start queuing requests, and this is what's known as buffer bloat. So you see it a lot of the times when you have a drastically slower uplink than you do your ingress connection. The router just ends up queuing the packets because it simply can't send more out. And on the other end, if your ISP is suffering from buffer bloat, they can't deliver any more packets through your connection. There's a router, there's a switch, something that's not able to pass that traffic properly. So that's the biggest thing that I can do on rural networks to kind of help alleviate the connection, and it's noticeable. It's a night and day difference. After you've got the settings in and after you've adjusted them.
Okay. Now, Adam, let me ask you, from your standpoint, do you have to deal with anything like this where you have customers that have slow connections that you have to deal with?
No. Yeah, no. In the area we support, which is Cedar Rapids, Iowa, it's a big enough area where everybody's pretty much got, I mean, it may be DSL or whatever. Most people are on fiber now, which just seems to be rock solid. But one thing we've run into, though, when some places do have slower connections, we can do what's either a bonded connection where you combine two connections, or you could do two connections where you do a load balance. So some traffic will go on one side and one will go on the other. So those are some options there if you can get a wired connection. But if you're in a place where you're just kind of out in the middle of nowhere and wireless is your only option, something else you might look at, depending on cell signal, is something like a 4G LTE.
Now,
Right.
Is that an option, Cody?
Yeah, so that is certainly an option around here. Data in Canada is expensive. It's very expensive. There are carriers out there that once you hit your limit, they charge you $50, $75 a gigabyte. I looked into it recently. I thought that was a bit of a myth myself, until I actually dealt with a customer that's on a business plan, a fairly recent business plan, that charges $75 a gigabyte on their shared data plan. So they get 12 gigs as their small business plan. If even one of those people goes over that limit, all of a sudden the company receives a bill at $75 a gigabyte. So it's an option. It's expensive, but if it's absolutely necessary for the business, they need to be willing to pay it.
Now, is the bandwidth good enough is it better than even satellite?
It's fantastic. Most times you can achieve at least 25 megs over LTE around here. The LTE coverage is built up. It's very good, and actually, I believe that's why nobody has DSL, because these cell carriers decided, let's just build our wireless network. There's no sense in putting copper in the ground, because heaven forbid, nobody would want copper coming into their house. But so oftentimes you can see 25, 30 meg connections, and for an uplink, it's not uncommon to see 15 or even 20 megs for an upload connection.
This goes back to an age-old wives' tale where people say you can actually run whatever you're doing on the internet over a wireless connection. And to that, I'll say it works most of the time. The problem is anytime you have a signal that is going from one point to another point that's not via a wire, a direct connection, it's going through the air, traveling through people's bodies, through homes, through buildings, through the clouds. You have all these things that are interfering with this, bouncing this signal, and that's why it can work in a lot of situations. And for what a lot of people do, it's a perfect solution. But I personally, there's a lot of people that are hoping, Cody, for what you guys have, and they're hoping that we can go to these wireless networks, even here in the States, and that's what everybody's going to run their network from. Just like the self-driving cars, for some reason, people that don't understand the auto industry think that we're going to have self-driving cars here in the next 5 years, which we're not. We already have self-driving cars, but they're not going to become mainstream. Neither are battery-powered cars. Not going to happen. You all can wishful think all day long. It doesn't matter. It's not going to happen. The car industry does not move that way. I don't care what Tesla is doing or anybody else. It's not that simple.
But Jeff, think of how fast they have grown in this short period of time. Do you not think they are growing exponentially, both in terms of knowledge and research and development?
The problem is you have this one dirty word called government that gets involved that stops all that from moving forward. And here's what I say to a lot of that. This is a little side tangent, talking about battery power. And the only reason I talk about battery power is because I do things with, mine's actually going to be engine powered, but I just went to a fly-in and we're looking at some of the different devices out there, and they want to get these basically bikes that are like hovercraft, but they run on batteries and they're really light. Problem is, a lot of the stuff that you see, the battery technology is 40 years old. It absolutely sucks. And nobody has cracked that yet. And so a lot of times these things with wireless infrastructure, the self-driving cars, all these automated systems, fly-by-wire, all that kind of stuff, it's just not there. And it's not going to be there for a long time. Hopefully somebody will crack that nut. But at this point, it's not happening. So I'm wondering, let's face it, everybody would love to have a wireless connection so you don't have to run wires through your walls. You don't have to run, you don't have to, do any of that stuff. I'd love it. Who wants to run speakers from the front of your television into the floor so you can run some rear speakers to the rear of the room when I can just do it wireless? That would be awesome, but not realistic because of the little thing called latency. And that's definitely a big problem. So, Adam, I like your idea of basically talking about not only the shaping of the traffic, but, even doing like a bonded signal. I'm almost wondering if you could have even two different wireless sources that you could pull together to make your situation even faster. It's definitely a question. I don't know that there's definitely an answer out there from the wireless aspect.
Yeah, I've not seen it in use in wireless. It's probably more for Cody since he works in that realm, but I would think it would be theoretically possible. But if you're already having an issue, usually I would think with WISP, it's more of a signal issue than a bandwidth issue, I would think.
Right. So, obviously there are some customers that I deal with that are both my customers and a customer of the WISP I work for, because the territories do overlap. But even with other WISPs out there, the principle is still the same. if you're going to have two CPEs, client premise equipment, it's usually the little box or the antenna, so to speak, that would go on the side of your house that connects back to the tower. Oftentimes, you're absolutely right, Adam. Oftentimes, that's the only line of sight they have to that specific tower. So in order to actually make a difference on a bonded connection, they'd likely need to be connecting to two different towers, because if they're both going to connect to the same tower, they're both going to receive the same quality of connection, no matter what they're doing on the connection. Unless maybe you have a kid in the house that does gaming and he has his own link on his own connection. You can probably get a difference, but it's no better than your internet service provider just increasing your overall speed. That would be a better solution than to bond two of them in the wireless industry, at least.
And that's a good thing to think about too. I'm just thinking you can separate. You could probably even do this in a business too. You could separate these services out. Yes, you're going to double pay for the services, but you could have, for instance, you could have the office computers on one network, one wireless network, and then maybe you have your guest network or something else, server, whatever, on another network.
Absolutely, and I mean, with a client that I have that's currently pays for internet from a provider, they weren't willing to increase his speed. They were saying this is the max that you can do on one connection. So he had told me that he inquired to them about adding another connection, and that they were absolutely willing to do that. So I think in that case, it might just be more about adding another account. But he sees if one connection is slow, there's a good chance that the other connection is slow. However, he did get his wish. He does have double the bandwidth, double the theoretical capacity. But if that tower is busy, or perhaps the provider isn't managing traffic properly on that tower, he's going to run into the same problems on both connections. You can load balance if you were with two different providers. Perhaps you could load balance, and I would be more interested to look at that. I don't have any clients that are like that, but to say that it's not possible would I couldn't agree with that. Something's always possible.
Very good. Adam, you're going to say something?
Oh, I was going to say, as far as for bonded connections, normally what we see is and it's rare that we run down this route, but if we have a client where the ISP has a maximum, let's say a 5 meg down and 512 kilobytes up, or somewhere up to a meg up, limit just based on their hardware or service or whatever, then you could get two of those connections and bond them to get larger. So usually in a case where we're going to do bonding or load balancing is a situation where we can't increase bandwidth on that one connection.
All right. So, Cody, let me ask you another question. So what do you do about things like backup?
So oftentimes backup is very hard. I'm not going to say it's not possible. It's very hard. For clients, I have a client that absolutely 100% requires an offsite backup. It's in his contract, it's in his stipulations, but he doesn't have the uplink that he needs to be able to do it. He doesn't want to move his office. He likes having his office at home. So what I've actually done is he's got his satellite connection, which is on his shed at the top of the hill. It's got a bridged wireless connection between his shed and his house. And actually in that shed is just another NAS that is the offsite backup that runs over that point-to-point link. The point-to-point link between the shed and the house can handle well over 500 megabits. He sends the files there, and then absolute critical files actually get uploaded at night, generally between 2 and 6 a.m., where there's no necessary restriction for data caps, and the speeds actually do go up quite a bit for the uplinks. So any mission critical documents, he knows that he needs to back those up. He needs to have them in the folder that actually syncs online versus just the local backup there. And he's pretty good about that. That's something that I ended up having to work out with him and said, look, if this is what you want, this is how it's going to have to work. He does have a cellular connection that we've recently switched to that seems to be helping. But again, due to where he is, trees and hills, it's the speed's just not there. He'll get faster speeds on his satellite connection in the middle of the night.
Now, I know people that do this that even here recently that don't want to pay for necessarily an online or cloud backup is they will actually they'll buy a couple of USB drives. They'll back their files up. At the end of the day, they grab that and maybe that goes to work with them the next day or back to the home or vice versa, depending on where they operate out of. But then they'll swap that every other day or every day and kind of have that back and forth where you've got one sitting in another spot and you've got one sitting wherever you're backing your data up at that time.
So that's something that I did discuss with him. He wanted more of a solution that he didn't have to remember to bring the flash drive or the hard drive home every day. And obviously in the situation that he's in, he's never going to have a 100% reliable backup. But it's 99.99% backup. What are the chances that that shed's going to light on fire and he loses the stuff at the house? They're there, but for what he does, it works out for him. And like I said, those small files, oftentimes they're document spreadsheets, get uploaded to the cloud at night anyway. So he's good there. But it was a solution that I not only had to think about how to set it up, but I also very much needed to educate the customer. A lot of the times, we get frustrated when we try to explain this is why you need to have a backup or we build it into our sales pitch. But he's a pretty down to earth guy. I say, look, this is where you live. You chose to run your business out of your home. Not necessarily a bad thing. I'm sure your business is successful, but these are the consequences of where you live. This is a product of your environment. So this is what we can do to help mitigate things like that. But again, you don't have a constant line to your favorite cloud backup provider. It's just not something that's in the cards. Maybe in the future, as these networks tend to expand and we do with what we can. But like I said, for him, it works. It's not something that I would normally do, but we got it working for him.
Well, and that's part of really what we do as business owners is we basically come up with a solution, and you're coming up with the solutions. They're going to work for that situation, which is awesome because a lot of people would go, I don't know what you're going to do, move, or whatever, or get a different service. But a lot of times you're in a situation where you can't do that. Now, what about things like, obviously, you're not doing anything else in the cloud either, are you?
So you'd be surprised. I do a lot of remote management. It is the basis of what I do, and it works most of the time. A lot of the things with these internet connections, you'll find that it's most of the time it works. So I am able to get in. I might have to lower the resolution. I might have to turn on the 256 color mode to actually get in there and be able to do things. But it does work, and customers are grateful for that. In that, if they're fairly far away, if they're out in the middle of nowhere, it can be a day or two, 3 or 4 days until I can actually get out to your site. I have approximately 30 managed residential users that all seem to be ticking away. Once in a while, I'll get a ticket in to take a look at something. But for the most part, I do what I can on site with the fact in mind that later on I might not be able to connect to this person, or on a bad weather day, if their equipment from their provider is blowing around or there's ice on it, I might not be able to connect to this person. So a lot of what I do is proactive stuff in customers' homes. Installing timers on the PoE injector that's on the equipment to the roof. Have it restart every night at 3 in the morning, because for whatever reason with Ubiquiti equipment, it seems that as soon as you restart it, it's fine. So that's something that if I don't want to receive a call, it's something that I need to suggest. I know down there you guys have aisle 8 and Wattbox. They're not so Canadian friendly, but it can be done, and I've been very interested in maybe getting one up here to try out. But so far, there's a lot of proactive stuff that you need to do when you're going into a customer's homes with that in mind. You need to go in thinking that, hey, there's a good chance that I might not be able to access this person tonight at 7 p.m. when the tower they connect to, all the other 60 people on that tower decide to watch Netflix at the same time. And I need to make sure that the customer is aware of that. Look, these are the absolute limitations of what I can and can't do. I primarily run after hours support. So most of the time, the customers are on my way back home from work anyway. So if I can squeeze in service calls and schedule things like that for customers, it ends up working out. But customers are aware that it might be a day or two until I'm able to get out to them. If I can't remote in, if they're having issues with their equipment. So I set that expectation at the beginning. The customers are fine. My business clients are fine with it. A lot of them are 9 to 5 businesses where if anything gets done, it gets done after hours anyway. And I have keys for clients' businesses. I can go in, I can do what I need to do, and I can flip them an invoice after. And it just works.
All right, very good. Now, Cody, these are not just the problems I'm sure that somebody who lives in a rural area has, because obviously we go through some of the same things when it comes to supporting our customers nothing's 100%. As Cody had said earlier, nothing is 100%. It works most of the time. And whether you're thinking about remote support or cloud backup or any of these types of things, is there anything you do in any of the situations where you might have a specialized situation that you have to use for your customers because either their connection's not real great or less than kind of what the rest of your customers are?
My philosophy is that even though they may not have the greatest connection from their ISP, I can do what I can to make the connection inside their home or business the best that it possibly can be. So whether it's staying on top of replacing old wiring, there's a couple businesses that I've gone into that have older wiring, have frayed wiring that needs to be addressed, and it's not even an option when I onboard that client. Obviously we all go around and do our checks, but I let them know that, hey, this is something that's pertinent. It's pertinent to your connection. Fixing it isn't going to give you 100 megabit speeds out of your business because you're still restricted by your ISP, but you want to gain the reliability and gain the uptime that you can within your place of business. And then when the ISP is having issues or you're having issue with your provider, I can call them and say, look, this network is rock solid. I've done my due diligence. I've done my troubleshooting. I firmly believe that it's something on your end. Let's troubleshoot this. Let's get this fixed.
All right, Adam, you got anything to add to any of that? Things
Yeah.
you deal with?
Well, I wanted to touch on the backup piece a little bit. So, back with swapping drives and things like that. So, obviously, the weakest point in this whole system is always the human. We actually acquired a client because of that. So it's a small business. They started out with bare minimum to get going, as most people do. And so they were using a 2-disk NAS for all of their files. And then the owner was doing backups to an external drive every day. And of course, something came up. He forgot one day. The NAS failed. And at that point, he's like, well, no big deal. I have backups. And then he went to check backups and realized he hadn't done one for a year. Because once you get off that cycle of doing it, you never do it again. And so we were able to get all the data back, and it was fine, and they wouldn't have gone out of business because of it, but it would have been a huge pain point, to lose a year's worth of data. But another point is, even with some of our larger customers, their data doesn't change that much day to day. Right. So when you're doing a backup, usually it's just the changed blocks or changed files. So a lot of services will provide a seeding service where you can get an external drive from them or provide it yourself, get a full backup on there, send it to them, and then you're only uploading your changes every day in order to get ahead of that bandwidth limitation. Now, it sounds like for a lot of Cody stuff, that's kind of on the extreme edge, so even that may not work, but it's still a solution if you have a slow connection. And let's say you have 200 gigs you need to get backed up, but if you don't have enough band limit, you may not never get to the point where you're on a current backup. So seeding is a possibility where you send them a drive of a full backup, and then you only have a minimum amount to catch up with.
That's a good point. Cody, have you ever used anything like that?
So I've never, I've certainly heard of it. I know Amazon offers a pretty robust large enterprise version of it, and that's probably the most that I've actually read into it. But it is certainly a viable option. If I had more of a, it's probably something that I would offer to perhaps accountants, or if I got on board with, like, let's say a payroll company or something like that, just in case, to be able to have those historical records. Now, mind you, Adam is right. Once you have that initial backup, it's just incremental backups from there. But there are a lot of times where even 100 gigabyte backup, it's just not going to go. So I would certainly be interested in those services, but for a lot of customers, just by the way you've described it, Adam, it sounds pretty expensive.
A lot of times, actually, they'll offer it for free, depending on the backup service. And I'm not talking on the scale of Amazon. There's a lot of online backup services that'll do that. It's certainly something to look into. And everybody's always got negotiation ability, whether the vendor wants to tell you that or not. So if you try to get signed up with somebody, say, look, I got this client, we'll sign up with you, but I need you to provide this preceding service in order to get us set up. So usually, a lot of times, they'll include it for free because it's only a one-time thing normally. Once you get that bulk of the data up there, the small changes are fine. And most of them will also offer to send you a drive to do a restore. Now, there's a cost associated with that, but normally you're not doing a lot of restores anyway.
And I don't know that the cost because Carbonite does that for me. I can basically, if I need all my data back, whatever 700 some odd gigs I have up there right now, if I needed to and I didn't have the bandwidth to pull it down, they could send me a drive, and that's part of the service that I pay for the year. And I'm going to say it's $150 maybe. So for the residential side, to me, and I think even the seeding services aren't that expensive. The biggest thing is they want to get their drive back. So a lot of times they'll send a drive out, whether you're getting your data back or you're seeding it, but they want to make sure that they get the drive back. And obviously, if you're seeding the service, you've got to get it back to them anyways. They'll charge you for the cost of the drive if you don't get it back to them, is basically what I'm saying. So I don't know that it's really that expensive overall. And it's, like you guys said, it's one time. So that might be something to look into.
Now, something, because I primarily use Cloudberry for backup. It's integrated. It works great. I'm just looking through now. Does Cloudberry offer a seeding service?
That I'm not sure about, since they use third-party storage providers, and it's been probably a year since I've used them. I would just suggest reaching out to them and see what they offer. I can't say for sure.
Yeah, I think they provide the interaction between your computer and whatever third party that you're using.
Right, they end up being the middleman. For in most instances, it ends up going to Amazon. So I didn't know if maybe they maybe offered that service on your behalf. I didn't see anything about it, but yeah, I do see. Obviously, it's a great option with Carbonite, particularly if starting out that let's say you're dealing with a company that does a lot of video editing or a lot of multimedia. I would hope that they're not in the middle of nowhere on a satellite connection, but for the times that does occur, I presume that it would come in quite handy.
Yeah, I remember back in the day, I was supporting a church, and they would do all their own audio visual stuff, and it was hundreds and hundreds of gigs a day that they would share back and forth. It was insane. And they need, now that was internal, so it was not that big a deal. Obviously, if you have a good enough, internet, but backing that stuff up, that goes into a whole nother thing. Hey, do I do what do I use for a local drive? Do I use an NAS back then, tape drive, cloud solution, whatever it was? And I remember it's funny because that was back in the day when they would have, their internet service was like 1.5 down and 1.5 up. So it was a long time ago. And it's funny because nowadays your cable connections are so much cheaper, even though we complain about it, compared to what they were getting their service for back then. And once I remember when we were able to get cable and I'd moved them off of that, it was like, hey, we could do this a lot cheaper, and you're going to have a lot more bandwidth than what you had in the past, and you're not going to pay the exorbitant prices for it.
Right. Well, so you actually you bring up a good point there, and it actually just flashed me back to one of the customers that I dealt with at the beginning. So again, we're talking about this rural connection that they have. It's fixed wireless. I think they had like a 10-in-1 connection, but so I go into this business. I get the documentation from the outgoing tech, and I look everything over. And one of the things that I noticed was that they had a server, they had a file server, but it still seemed like machines were backing up individually. So out of the maybe 15 machines that were in the office, they were backing up some sort of, they obviously weren't using a domain. Otherwise, sending your files to the file server and then having that file server backup is trivial. But these people weren't on the domain. They had a server that was essentially just a file server. None of the other features were being utilized. And like I said, these 15 machines were all backing up individually. So we had the 3 accountants where their machines were all kind of, just backing up whenever, which again, on a maybe on a fiber or a cable or a larger connection, that's great. You can do that up to the minute. But on a fixed wireless connection, having that many requests at once, particularly if they're larger files, and and it's not just backing up the changes, you're introducing new things, can saturate the connection. And once your upload's saturated, of course, your downloads will crash. You can't send out any more requests on the network. So these are all things that I do keep in mind when I'm onboarding the client, when I'm going into a new business. It's almost an extra step I have to take. What do I need to think about, especially because this client is remote, because this client doesn't have that amazing gigabit connection or that amazing 100 meg connection? What are some things that I need to do differently than perhaps some of my residential or business clients that I deal with in town here?
Well, Cody, you could also say, and I know this from my experience, that situation that you just painted, where you basically had all these machines backing up and you had a server, that was kind of a dumb setup, for lack of better terms. Basically, it's always going to be better because even our bandwidth, where we have it, a lot of times your upload speed's a lot lower anyways. You're still going to run into constraints. So you definitely would want to sync to a server and have the server do the backup to the cloud, to an external drive, whatever it might be. Do you agree, Cody? I mean, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, it usually actually comes down to a price point. We can offer to back up all the workstations and the server and all that. Normally, they go, or they're like, well, how can we save money on this? They always start off, we don't want to be cheap, but how can we save money? And you're like, yeah, okay. So if we back up everything to the server, we have one device to back up. That's normally how we do it. But yeah, we would agree with that. That's back up one device rather than all of them.
And with me personally, once I'm in there, once I've completed my onboarding process, I will obviously offer to that customer the benefits of doing it this way, doing it that way. Hey, these 3 accountants absolutely need to have up to the minute backups, because they could do something in an hour that's quite a bit of changes, but if it can't be backed up right away, if something goes wrong, they need those latest changes. So it is something that I offer. Obviously, it comes at an extra price for uh, workstation backup and local profile backup, but in a lot of cases, I can work with the customer whether I'm using a NAS or whether I'm using just a Windows server of some sort. Oftentimes, I'll work at it with the customer based on their needs, but it's our job as the technician to not only explain why they need it, but just it's talked about so frequently. But what happens when you don't have it? What happens when what happens when snow goes on your roof and your connection's out for 7 days? You need to have something. You need to have some sort of contingency plan in place for your business or even for your home. It's not as critical in your home, but I have a contingency plan for my network when it goes down in the home because I have a lot of mission critical stuff that's public facing in my home network, so to speak.
Yeah, I have a game plan too. I curl up in a ball and cry like a little baby.
It's amazing when you realize that your computer can do other things even though there isn't internet. It's the weirdest thing.
What, Adam? What you mean, like play solitaire?
Sure.
MS Paint. It's always fun.
I'm sorry, we moved up a little bit with Windows 10. You got that cool 3D paint program. That's
my
cool.
apologies. My apologies.
I mean, I like Farming Simulator, but
That's funny. And it's an interesting point because I think about gaming. Now, fortunately, gaming services that I use, Steam, Sony's gaming Origin, and all that kind of stuff you play. A lot of these you can now it wants you to check in, and I don't know what the algorithm is set at, but it wants you to check in every once in a while. It might be once every couple weeks. It needs to check in to make sure that you have some sort of connection. You actually own these games. But I've ran into situations before where it's like I went to play a game I hadn't been on in a while, and for whatever reason, the connection was down, and it wouldn't let me play like in offline mode. It got stuck in this weird thing. So, from a business standpoint, though, I'm sure that a lot of software goes through those same types of things where you get stuck, and now what do you do? Oh, I can't even do the offline stuff because it's not saying that I can use it, or it's not going to work for me in this particular situation. So definitely there are no perfect solutions for sure. But Cody, it's nice to see that you're thinking of those things, especially in a rural area. And you're not the only one. I know there's a lot of people that listen to this show that basically are in rural areas, and bandwidth and availability is always something that's talked about by a lot of people. So it's definitely common. You probably have worse snowstorms up there that would affect things more, but other than that, everything's probably pretty much the same depending on where you are in the country.
other than price.
Well, exactly. I'm sorry. There is the Canadian tax. It's kind of like the Apple tax, but different.
Right. I pretty much assume that everything's more expensive, in the Great White North up here. You're absolutely right. It is no different than maybe a tech working in a large city that deals with only fiber connections at their customers' homes. It is no different. But at the end of the day, it comes down to educating your customer and letting them know what they should expect, because there's nothing more that disappoints your customer when something unexpected happens. Even good things can be unexpected, and the customer might freak out for a minute. But if I can eliminate those little freakouts and those little panics until they can get in touch with me, or until I can remote in and fix and see what's going on, that keeps the customer happy. And if the customer's not frazzled, they're not coming into the conversation, or they're not coming into the remote session frazzled with me. They're calm. They know what they need to do. They know that their connection might be down. It may have been down for the past 12 hours. It's back, but it's slow. Maybe I can't remote to them. Maybe I have to truck roll. My customers are aware that they need to have some sort of plan in place, that even when it comes to running the non-technical side or the non-business side of their business, they need to be able to deal with that. They need to be able to handle that. Now, I always speak in worst case scenarios. My response times are generally most of the time I can do same day. Whether it's early morning or after 5 p.m. Most of the time I'm able to do same day. The most I've ever had someone wait was 2 days out. And that's just because I'm swamped. So, as a tech, I don't take on more than I can handle. If I ever reach to the point where I need to add a secondary employee or maybe start contracting out services, I know what that point is, and I know what to expect when I reach that.
That's very good. Very well said. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll have our ending comments on this subject that I think it will definitely help people think, and think about things that they can do no matter what situation they're in. If you'd like to support what we're doing here and you'd like to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/computer repair podcast. And I just want to thank all of our Patreon supporters for your continued support. Now, what that gets you for about $4 a month, that's going to get you in the secret Facebook group where we come and we share ideas and get help from each other in a nice, safe environment where nobody makes fun of you, even if you come in with the simplest of questions. And that's why I always wanted to have something where I had control over it, to where we can control bad things happening that sometimes might happen otherwise. So if you guys want to do that, please go to patreon.com/computer repair podcast. It's real easy to sign up and get you started there. All right, let's have some lasting comments. Adam, anything you want to add to the stuff? And I know there wasn't a whole lot for you to say as far as the rural area, because you work in a area like I do, which has fiber and cable and all kinds of stuff all around. But do you have any lasting comments that you want to say?
No, I think we pretty much covered everything I had to offer.
Gotcha. And Cody, what about you?
No, I like I said, anytime you're onboarding a client, I think it's very important to once again set expectations, know what you're roping yourself into, and know what the customer knows what to expect. Whether you're rescuing them from a previous, so to speak, pizza tech, or it's a brand new client just starting off for the first time, maybe with their business or their home network. Set the expectations. You as a tech, it'll only make you look better as a tech, and it'll save yourself a lot of headache in the end.
Most of the time, we're basically saving themselves from themselves, and they're usually the cause of the problem most of the time. So that's that's one thing to keep in mind. All right, I think we've covered a lot in this show, and I'll tell you what, Cody, if you'd like to let people know where they can find out more about you.
Yeah, so I run IT North Solutions. That's out of Havelock, Ontario, up here in Canada. I can always be reached. You can always shoot me an email, hello@itnorth.tech. I actually pick up my phone, if I'm able to. So you can always give me a call, 705-219-1200. But you'll get a faster response emailing me or even just filling out the contact form on my website or opening a ticket, of course.
Awesome. And Adam, appreciate you as always. If you can let people know where they can find you at.
Sure. Tag me in the Facebook group, or you can email me, acarpenter@itproiowa.com.
Awesome. All right. If you guys like, come join us live every week for the Computer Repair Podcast every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern over at podnutz.com/CRP Live. You can join in on the conversation by hanging out in the chat room. You can also send an email if you've noticed over the last couple of weeks. We haven't had any emails. Here is your opportunity now to send some emails in if you want to get your questions answered. And you can do that by sending it to podnutz@podnutz.com. Very easy. Same word twice over with an @ symbol in the middle and a .com on the end. All right. Or you can leave a voicemail. You can actually call the show and it's 734-335-1000. And you can leave a voicemail, which we will play on the show and answer any questions or talk about any types of things that you would like. I want to thank everyone for listening to and subscribing to the show. We'll see you next time on the Computer Repair Podcast.